Morning, colleagues. I'm pleased to have an opportunity to update you on our assessment here at the Business Council of BC of the evolving economic and business landscape in what it remains a very kind of extraordinary period for anybody doing economic analysis, let alone economic forecasting. I'm JOCK. I'm a senior policy advisor here at the Business Council, and I work with my fellow economist colleagues Ken Peacock and David Williams to try and understand the BC economy, what makes it tick, and what the prospects are for our province as we come out of the COVID shock. Just a couple of preliminary observations about the macroeconomic picture before we drill down into BC. 2020 will go down as the worst year for global economic growth since the Depression. In the 1930s, world output declined by about 3% in inflation-adjusted terms in 2020. And just to put that in perspective, if you go back to the global financial crisis of 2008-9, during that period, the global economy actually continued to grow. So there was positive growth worldwide, even during the global financial crisis. That was not the case this time around, due to the severity of the COVID shock, its widespread nature, and of course the extraordinary measures that were taken to try and slow the spread of the virus, which involved shutting down broad swaths of the economy, not just here, but right around the world. So we saw about a 3% decline in world output in 2020. Among the advanced economies, Canada was actually hit, relatively hard. When we get the final numbers, it'll probably show a 5% or so decline in the Canadian real GDP last year. And BC, we think, is more or less in the same range. And we'll talk a bit about why that's the case. A little bit of a puzzle, frankly, because in BC, on the whole, we've been less severely impacted by the virus and by the measures taken to contain it than some other provinces. Certainly Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec have all been hit harder than British Columbia in economic terms over the past year. And yet we see a fairly steep decline in GDP in British Columbia nonetheless. And I'll talk a bit about the reasons for that. A comment on the US. We've all been riveted, I think, watching developments in the United States during 2020 and into the early months of 2021. Both the kind of chaotic political environment and the bumpy handoff to a new administration, but also the atrocious job that the Americans have done on the whole in managing the COVID shock. Notwithstanding that, it's worth noting that the US economy shrank by less than Canada in 2020. They're down about 3.5% in terms of real GDP on a year-over-year basis. And we're expecting the US economy to go barreling out of the crisis this year, supported by very strong policy stimulus, very high levels of household savings, which means a lot of Americans are primed to start spending again when conditions improve. And very importantly, the rapid vaccination, certainly rapid by Canadian standards, that we're seeing of the American population. So the US is going to, I think, do quite a bit better than Canada in 2021. A couple of risk factors out there for us in Canada, and particularly in British Columbia, as we look out, and we certainly do expect an improvement in economic conditions this year in British Columbia compared to the very dismal numbers we saw last year. But a couple of risks. The biggest one is the virus itself, whether the variants that we're now managing spread rapidly, how quickly the vaccination process works, and how effective and efficacious the vaccines are in protecting people. Those are all things that are outside our control, certainly as forecasters. The other unknown, I think, importantly, is the border. Will the Canada-US border reopen in any meaningful sense in 2021? And if not, then what does that mean for our overall economy? And then a third factor, quite important to BC and important to our post-secondary institutions, is actually what happens to immigration, both permanent immigration and temporary foreigners who are coming here on work and study visas. Those numbers, both for permanent and temporary, of course, fell quite dramatically in 2020. The federal government in particular is working to dial those numbers back up, but I think it remains a bit unclear how effective that will be. A couple of comments on BC. In 2020, we estimated a decline in GDP of around 5% on an inflation-adjusted basis. That's double, more or less double the decline that we experienced in the last recession in 2008-9. We saw 400,000 jobs disappear seemingly in the blink of an eye back in the spring of 2020, and it was a truly kind of unprecedented time in my working career watching that carnage play out in the labor market. The good news for us, though, is we've recovered well over 90% of the job losses that were incurred in the February to April period last year were recovered by the end of 2020. So we've seen, I would describe it as a surprising rebound in the overall job market in BC. And I think that reflects a couple of things. One is we've seen a strong recovery in our many of our export industries in the last 6 months of 2020. Resources, certainly, manufactured goods, high technology, the film and TV production industry as well, came back surprisingly strongly in the second half of 2020, and that helped to sort of pave the way for recovery. Second has been the strength of the housing market. Many of us last spring expected a much weaker residential real estate market in the province. Instead, fed in part by record low mortgage rates, we've seen real strength in housing transactions. Housing starts fell off in 2020 compared to the year before, but sales activity was up and average prices were up about 12%. Transactions were up actually 20% over the full year in the province, which is remarkable considering what we were going through. And prices were up sort of 10 to 12%, which again defied the expectations a lot of forecasters had back in the spring. And that's obviously helped as well. BC has also benefited a lot from the government support measures, particularly the federal government support measures to assist households, students, and businesses to stay afloat during the COVID shock. The BC government has been a secondary player in providing support. The vast majority of it has come from the Government of Canada. The federal balance sheet has borne most of the burden of the COVID support programs. We estimate in 2020 as a whole, well over $20 billion of federal money was injected into British Columbia for displaced workers, for students, for businesses, for nonprofit organizations, for Indigenous communities and others. And that really helped to keep the economy from tipping over into an even worse downturn. And I think that played quite an important role in the rebound that we saw in the job market. Now, it's not good news across the board, that's for sure. The consumer-facing industries, particularly tourism, travel, personal services, some segments of retail, have really taken a drubbing from the COVID shock, and they remain in very tough shape. We are expecting a big surge, unfortunately, in insolvencies and business exits in the first half of 2021 as companies find they can't hang on any longer and as government support programs are likely to be wound down over the second half of the year. For the education sector, the people on this call will know much more about it than I do, but it's responded, I think, quite effectively to the shift to remote learning. It's important that we continue to grow this sector. International education, as your organization knows, is one of the top 5 or 6 export industries in BC, generating well over $2 billion a year from international students in the province, most of whom are in post-secondary institutions of one sort or another. So that's a sector we want to come back. I'd be very interested to see whether the student visa numbers for 2021 pick up after the declines we saw last year. It's worth noting the federal government's decision to allow people here on student and work visas to move ahead in the queue for permanent immigration announced just a few weeks ago. That's probably going to play quite a powerful role, I think, in cementing Canada's relative attractiveness for international students in what's becoming a very competitive global landscape. So for 2021, after surviving 2020, we expect BC to post growth of somewhere around 4 to 5%. We should continue to see the labor market improve incrementally. If the border reopens, we'll see tourism come back. If not, tourism is going to remain, I think, a weak spot, unfortunately, for the bulk of 2021, certainly the first half of the year. One of the challenges for policy will be dialing back the support programs, which have been unprecedented and vast in quantity, both provincially and federally. And we'll have to see how our governments execute on that. Clearly, we can't continue to run the deficits that have been incurred, but we don't want to see too precipitous a dialing back of government support programs. It needs to be done in a measured way, or I think we could risk tipping the economy back into a bit of a downturn. So thanks for your attention. I did provide some background material for this economic commentary, and if there's any questions on follow-up, we'll be pleased to take them. Thanks very much.